Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Randy Thalen, and I'm the new CEO here at The Right Place. I wish we were meeting in person as I get launched in this new job that I started back in March, but it's still the way of the world right now that we have to do things via Zoom. But I'm pleased to be here and pleased to be with so many of you here this afternoon as we pulled this program together in pretty short order. Frankly, about a week ago, as this rescue plan really started to solidify and some of the details became more known, our team was getting calls left and right from so many of you. What did we think? What was happening? What did we know? And so rather than trying to do them all, one at a time, which frankly became a little bit impossible, we thought it'd be best to put this program here together this afternoon. Our intention is really to inform. We certainly don't pretend to have the answers. We have certainly some thoughts as to how we might want to proceed as a region, but we know all of you have big decisions to make in the weeks and months and years to come. So we want to be a resource for you. We want to be able to help inform certainly today and advise if that's appropriate. And myself, my team, we stand ready to assist. This is certainly a pivotal time. As somebody who's been in economic development now for 25 plus years, I've never seen anything quite like this. And I suspect our public partners on the call today are in the same boat. We've just never seen this volume of stimulus deployed in this way in such a short order. So it does present an extraordinary opportunity where it just, the volumes of dollars, the opportunities and the freedom to sort of spend and invest in certain ways gives us a chance as a region to really make some transformative decisions that can last not just over the next 6 to 12 months, but really have a legacy kind of impact in our community. So we're pleased to be able to bring this program forward with you and for you today. We want to have a robust conversation in the next hour. Our goal today is really just to help bring the best information we have at this moment forward, and you can expect to hear more from us in the weeks ahead. My colleague here at The Right Place, who really does a lot of our great work with our public partners, many of you know him and know him well, is Tim Mraz, and I'll ask him to come forward right now to walk you through the program. Tim, take it away.
Good deal. Thanks, Randy. On behalf of The Right Place, thanks for being part of this program today. A couple of things. First off, with the agenda, really what we're doing is we're breaking this. We decided to break this discussion into sort of thirds. The first third of the discussion is going to be probably what you guys are really most interested in, and that is all around, regarding the American Rescue Plan. What is the plan around public government, the state and local aid that's coming down? And our partners at Dickinson Wright are going to walk us through that. The second piece of it is I'm actually going to start walking you guys through the rest of the American Rescue Plan. Believe it or not, between the famous $1,400 checks that everybody's getting, in addition to the public, the state and local aid pieces, that's only about 48% of the funding. And so there's still about $1.1 trillion sitting out there in various other funds that I want to walk you guys through, just so you're aware of those as we go forward. And then we'll talk about maybe some next steps and some planning recommendations and how you may want to attack this and what resources are out there. And then finally, we'll open it up just for Q&A with you guys. We obviously want to hear from you guys, what questions you have, and hopefully we can answer anything any questions that you may have. Also, during the webinar, if you do have questions, there is a Q&A button at the bottom. Just go ahead and click on that Q&A button and type in your question. We'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar. And if you have any questions pertinent, we'll stop and ask those. If it's something that we can wait till the end, we'll save that till the end as well. As I mentioned, we're doing this in partnership with our friends at Dickinson Wright today. We're joined by two awesome attorneys, Jessica Wood and Peter Kulik. They will be walking us through the public side of the funding. Peter is currently the co-chair of the Dickinson Wright Tax Practice Group and represents clients in a variety of tax-related matters, including government incentives. And Jessica is a member of the Municipal Finance Group and represents various cities, townships, villages, and authorities in a variety of economic development matters. And as Randy mentioned, I think I do work with many or most of you, but if I have not had a chance to meet you, I'm Tim Mraz, the Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for The Right Place, and I'll be walking you through sort of the other areas of the rescue plan funding as well. So I want to share this with you before we get started. Again, I made an allusion to it, but this I think actually shares it the best. Is just shows you kind of a pie chart of what makes up this stimulus package that comes down. And so the one thing to keep in the back of your mind as we're going is that state and local aid, as Randy mentioned, is extremely huge and provides many opportunities for us. The one thing also to remember is there still is also over $1 trillion in other areas that will be coming down, from everything from FEMA to SBA to the education system, some of the healthcare, health and human services, and everything else. And we'll be talking about that as well. One of the things I do want to do before we get started is we are going to do a couple of polls during this webinar. We want to get your feedback on a couple of things. Jill, I think, is going to load up the first poll for us. One of the things we wanted to just ask you as we get going, and I think, do I need to stop sharing for that? There it is. Okay, so in terms of coming into this webinar today, how are you feeling about ARPA and your knowledge around it and the impact on your community? Just take a quick second here. We've got everything from, look, we got this, we're prepared, from we have a plan, to all the way down to, look, that's why I'm here today. I need to know what's going on. So if you just quick provide your feedback real quick. I will close that out as we are. I don't see the numbers changing too much at this point. So thank you for that. And with that, I want to hand it off to Jessica and Peter to take us through the public portion of the funding. Peter, Jessica, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jessica from Dickinson Wright, Jessica Wood. This is Peter Kulik, my partner, also from Dickinson Wright. And we get to, and happy April Fool's Day, by the way. We get to talk about the fun ways in which you get to spend this exciting money. And we're going to start with, if Jill, you could just move on to the next slide, the allocation. So, and Peter and I are just going to sort of go back and forth discussing what we know so far. Please keep in mind that we still anticipate getting guidance from the Department of Treasury, and we don't have that yet. So some of this is based on just sort of a pure reading of the statute, what we have so far, and also our experience with the CARES Act, which we believe is instructive in terms of giving us some guidance on how you can spend this money. So the state and local fiscal recovery funds are going to be distributed by the Department of Treasury. And something to keep in mind is that all the funds that you receive have to be spent by December 31st, 2024. That actually gives you more time than you had under the CARES Act. Right, Peter? How long did they have under the CARES Act? Much shorter time period?
The CARES Act had a really short window in that you had to spend the money from a period between basically March of 2020 to December 30th, 2020. So at least one of the initial benefits is that none of us are quite drinking out of 3 fire hydrants to spend the money, but maybe just 1 fire hydrant this time.
So the payments from Treasury are going to be released in 2 portions. The first within 60 days of enactment of the legislation, and the second one no earlier than 12 months after the first payment. So that gives us some idea of the timing here. Jill, if you want to go, thank you. So how this is divided up is $130.2 billion, give or take, billion dollars directly to the counties. And that will be based on the county share of the US population based on the most recent Census Bureau. And then about $65 billion to cities and other non-county municipalities, with about $45 billion of that going directly to those with populations of at least 50,000, using a little bit more complicated formula in that it involves a modified community development block grant formula, which is based on population size, poverty rates, and measures of housing instability. And then about $19.5 billion going indirectly through the states to what they're referring to as non-entitlement units. And I hate that name, it's so negative, but basically the important thing to remember is it means that you have a population of less than 50,000 people. And that allocation is based entirely on the percentage of the state population. It's just based on population. Because it could take a full year for Treasury to calculate and disperse the allocations to the non-entitlement units, Treasury is required to send those amounts to each state within the 60 days, and then the states have 30 days to disperse the funds based on population. but the states can also get up to 3 30-day extensions for that to happen. It's important to note that states cannot change the amount that's been allocated to you from the feds, nor can they add conditions or additional requirements to that amount or to that disbursement. Do you have anything to add to that, Peter, or no?
No, I think the allocation
Pretty
formula,
clear.
while complicated, it's straightforward.
Okay. This chart might be sort of unnecessary, but I think it just sort of highlights the amount of dollars we're talking out here. If you look at the state and local allocation estimates in billions, this is in billions. And so it's sort of fun to look at the different states, I think, in a nerdy sort of way, and what's going to states and then metropolitan cities. Again, that's cities that are 50,000 or above, and then the other entities. So kind of interesting. You can see Michigan gets a nice piece of that. And you can keep going, Jill, if you would. So this part, this is where it gets kind of gray, but also kind of fun, very ripe for good discussion. And that is, what are the allowable uses of these fiscal recovery fund dollars? So while the CARES Act was tied very tightly to COVID relief, and this arguably is too, this is drafted a little bit more loosely, and we think gives you more room for spending. So how the statute reads is that you're allowed to use these funds to respond to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19 or its negative economic impacts, which of course, you know, what wasn't negatively economically impacted by COVID, including assistance to households, small businesses and nonprofits, or aid to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. And maybe what I'll do is I'll go through these 4 quickly, and then Peter and I can talk about some examples and what we think this really means. You can also use the money for the provision of government services to the extent of the reduction in revenue. So specifically, like those hit very hard by the reduction in income tax due to the public health emergency. You can make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. And interestingly, this provision is not directly tied to COVID, at least not in the statute. And so this one really seems to give you the broadest leeway. And then you can also pay for premium pay for eligible workers performing essential work as determined by each state or tribal government during the pandemic. So those are the four categories that they included right in the statutory language itself. So Peter, do you have some examples or thoughts about these different categories?
Yeah, and kind of well, sorry, a little feedback there. You know, a couple thoughts is that, you know, tapping into a lot of the work that I spent last year on with advising governmental units on the coronavirus relief fund, and in compliance with it, and in looking at the different allowable uses, it's really items 1 and 4 that have a lot of analogies or a lot of similarities to the coronavirus relief fund. And in 1, we're looking at things, public health emergencies or negative economic impacts that are specifically or have some sort of causal relationship to the healthcare pandemic. And so it's nice to see that continue, and that gives us some examples, like whether it's paying the salaries of essential public workers or health workers, public safety, and then also being able to provide some hazard bonus pay through item number 4. What I find pretty interesting is the items that allow for more capital expenditures. In comparison to the coronavirus relief fund, you know, that was largely directed more towards a working capital type expenditures, with some ability to use to pay for capital expenditures, but really the focus was kind of an immediate need. So thinking of some examples, some of the easy ones to think about were, again, like some, maybe not necessarily all, but some of the payroll cost for essential workers, public health, public safety are examples. And then I think you can kind of expand onto some additional capital projects, specifically with the water, sewer, broadband infrastructure. Jessica, if you want to add some thoughts, turn it back to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it was very intentional the way this is written. Again, that those infrastructure improvements, they seem to be untethered to COVID. They seem to be more sort of long-term, and again, give you a lot more leeway to do things, long-term capital investments, like you said. So given that we don't have guidance yet, I mean, so far it looks like sort of the sky's the limit when it comes to things like, water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So I don't know if we want to, go ahead.
To me, that to reiterate, I think that's a game changer for the local governments, because there was a lot of, particularly with a remote workforce that has developed over the public health care pandemic, the COVID pandemic. I mean, this really gives an opportunity to build out that infrastructure that in a lot of cases is lacking, and it can also turn over into supporting the economic development for a region as we look to recover from this year plus remote environment.
So another thing that Peter and I discussed when we were looking at these categories is, for example, even though it doesn't say so, doesn't it go without saying that the money should be spent within your jurisdiction? Because of course the law doesn't straight out say that, but certainly the implication is that given that these allocations were based on the particular formulas applied to your jurisdiction, it would seem appropriate that the money be spent within your jurisdiction. So that's just one thing that we discussed. And then we also talked about, do the entities receiving these funds have to look for state authorization to spend the money in a particular way, or is it enough that the federal government has sort of generally authorized these expenditures? Because there is something called the prohibition on the lending of public credit, which is sort of a general principle that underlies all municipal expenditures, right? You're not generally allowed without statutory authority to just hand money over to private entities unless you can find some sort of public purpose there. And so we talked about that a little bit as well. And I don't know, Peter, if you have more thoughts on that, but our thought was that it's great that we have this federal authorization, but you should also make sure that you spend the money within your jurisdiction, and then also try to find some sort of state law that authorizes you to undergo the type of improvement or spending that you're considering.
Yeah, it's the attorney's dream or the attorney's nightmare, depending on your perspective. And it's I think the question you start running into is, does this federal law somehow preempt the state law? Of course, I'm not the municipal law attorney like Jessica, who could give the eloquent answer, but it seems like no, you still have to comply with state law is the right answer. And some, well, Jessica, go ahead and add some thoughts.
No, I mean, I think, for example, and I think this is maybe a good segue into the next slide, if we could. There's also authorization within the statute to transfer the funds that you get to certain defined entities. And in so doing, you might find that you end up, for example, let me go through these recipients. You can transfer these fund dollars to a private nonprofit organization, a tribal organization, a public benefit corporation involved in the transportation of passengers or cargo, or a special purpose unit of local government if it chooses. So that gives you a lot of leeway. For example, let's say you wanted to give some of this money to your DDA, which would be a special purpose unit, or to your housing commission, which would be a special purpose unit of state or local government. So in other words, you can transfer these dollars. Those entities still must use the dollars consistent with these broad purposes in the American Rescue Plan Act, but they have specific statutory authority at the state level to do all sorts of things under Michigan law. And while we anticipate that at least the Biden administration will view the expenditures very liberally, that could change. And you will be required, again, to track all of these expenditures and to provide reports. And so to be on the safe side, again, you would want to make sure that you can find some state law that also authorizes the type of improvement that you plan to spend this money on. Guidance, again, if you're trying to determine what this money can be used for, you can look at the guidance that was issued by Treasury for use in the CARES Act, because they actually, of course, publish regulations indicating, what was an eligible expenditure. Peter, do you have some examples of what was an eligible expenditure under the CARES Act?
Yeah, well, I've got a lot of examples, but a couple points. One, it's Treasury issued a lot of guidance. There weren't necessarily formal regulations issued. And the other point is that the American Recovery Rescue Plan Act is no more restrictive than the CARES Act. So that's why we say you can look to the CARES Act, and there's some parallels in language. Examples I think ranged from that I came across were a lot of focus on using CARES Act dollars to support payroll costs for public safety employees was a big area. They were also looking at expenditures to fund lease costs to get temporary places to either do COVID testing or vaccination sites, all those type of things. Of course, again, with this particular act, it's a lot broader in terms of what the potential uses are. I would say that I've seen some of the Q&A and chats, and not to jump in and step on anyone's toes, but suggesting that you could only use these funds, the fiscal recovery fund dollars, for one particular use. I'm curious to understand why certain organizations are taking that view and what they base their interpretation on. But it was pretty clear in the CARES Act, and I think even with this act, that you don't have to pick just one area, that you can use some money, for instance, for payroll cost, some money for budget shortfalls caused by the COVID healthcare pandemic, and perhaps others yet for capital expenditures or infrastructure improvement projects. So absent additional guidance from Treasury or Congress, I guess I'm not reading it that way. Jessica, I don't know if you want to share any thoughts.
No, I haven't read anything like that so far either. So I'd be curious to see how that develops. I guess I'd be surprised if things were sort of pigeonholed in that manner, but time will tell. If we could go to the next slide. So there are a few prohibited uses as well, right in the statute. And I'm sure you're all aware of these because I've heard a lot of people talking about these. One is that you can't use these to offset tax cuts. So, and then the other thing is you can't use them to fund unfunded pension funds. Although the answer to number 2 here is a little bit more complicated. And I'm going to let Peter talk about that because this issue does relate again to the CARES Act.
Yeah, and the question, at least I posed, is that you've got a statutory prohibition that says fiscal recovery fund dollars cannot be used to fund pensions. But what is clear is you can use this fiscal recovery fund to pay some payroll cost or certain payroll costs if there's the nexus between responding to the COVID-19 public health care pandemic. Typically, the view was taken that under the CARES Act, when you're covering payroll costs, that would be inclusive of eligible employee benefit costs, so welfare benefits and pension benefits. So that to me, I think it raises a question, probably no answer at this point until we get further guidance. But that's probably one to watch. I think that the pragmatic approach is, if you're starting to use money now, probably don't want to use those dollars for the pension benefit portion of payroll cost.
All right, can we move to the next slide? Thank you. So then there are some reporting requirements and certification requirements that go along with these funds. States are required to report how the funds are used and how their tax revenue was modified during the time that the funds were spent during the covered period, which begins March 3rd and ends on the last day of the fiscal year that they've expended or returned the funds to Treasury. And this is, I think, to make sure that the states don't disengage in tax cuts and try to make up for it using these funds. Local governments will be required to provide periodic reports providing a detailed accounting of the use of funds. And while we don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, we would recommend that you keep these funds in a separate account and that you can track them very carefully so that when we do find out what sort of periodic reports are required, you can track that spending. And then if it's found later that you haven't complied with these provisions, as vague as they are, you could be required to repay the Treasury an equal amount of the funds used in violation of the permitted uses. So again, not knowing exactly what they're going to require in terms of reports, we would say err on the conservative side and track these funds, keep them separate, and be able to explain exactly how they were used. Now, that's not to say that you can't use them in combination with other funds, but just make sure that you've tracked everything. Would you agree with that, Peter?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we can jump to the slide where we raise some practical considerations. And you know, one of the experiences I had that of a local unit of government that I thought did a great job under the coronavirus relief fund at tracking was that they were, as Jessica alluded, they had a segregated account where funds were at. They were able to, in effect, do a direct tracing of expenditures. You know, the other point, I don't know, Jill, if you could switch to the next slide, that might be helpful. So some practical considerations, what's next? You know, tabbing on to the record-keeping compliance is you do want to have a history of how the funds were spent to be able to track those, because we do believe Treasury is going to be asking those questions. Likely they're going to send some form of questionnaire with some detailed reporting requirements. It could be like a pro forma type that shows sources and uses and how you spent money. In some instances, it might be even appropriate to go a step further and have like a backup documentation that would support why a particular expense meets the eligibility requirements. I think a best practice takeaway can be developing a plan or developing a wish list of expenditures in a priority, because it's good to have a lot of extra projects or expenses than dollars available, because you can move through those, particularly if you kind of take the approach of like green, yellow, red, where green is a good expenditure, yellow is questionable, red is a no-go. The other thing with what we learned with the CARES Act is that the guidance was often coming out very cautiously, very strict, and then over time it's sort of liberalized and got more expansive. So evolution is likely. Jessica, turn it over to you to have some additional thoughts.
Uh-oh, I did it. I left it on mute and started talking. Nope, those all are good common sense, I think, recommendations, and that's good to know about the guidance under the CARES Act. If we could go to the next slide. So just in terms of economic development possibilities, again, there's this broad sort of untethered authorization to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. And this is just huge, frankly, and key to sort of long-term recovery from the pandemic. And I don't know, Peter, I know you are the one who wrote the slide about the broadband and so forth, and how important you feel about sort of these long-term investments, as opposed to the short-term filling the gaps in your budget. These are the long-term solutions, because of course we're going to feel the effects of COVID for many, many years to come. And this is giving you the leeway to go ahead and make those investments.
Yeah, and hopefully there's enough of an allocation to cover multiple different buckets of expenditures. And the thinking of our state, and we do have infrastructure investments that are needed, and oftentimes that I see in projects that I've worked on throughout the years, and tagging on to what Randy said, this is a historic opportunity, historic amount of dollars, historic opportunity in terms of it is changing how we work, where we work, and it gives all of the folks in the economic development profession some time to rethink of what is our future workforce infrastructure looks like, environment looks like. Often with projects, the infrastructure cost can be picking up sewers, broadband, water systems that they can be the tipping point of whether a project goes forward or not. And so to have these dollars available that aren't going to break the bank for a project is, I think, a pretty incredible tool. And Jessica, but I think at the same time, you probably have some state law considerations that you need to take into account as you use those dollars and how you appropriate them.
Right, exactly, right. Just again, just sort of reiterating what I touched on before, just because we have this broad authorization at the federal level doesn't mean you don't have to look to state law as well and determine whether you have the authority to undertake that particular endeavor. Now, a lot of these are traditional municipal improvements, water, sewer, broadband, et cetera. Infrastructure, of course, those are traditional municipal expenditures. The less traditional authorized expenditures are the ones that were listed, on a previous slide, that have to do with like assistance to households and so forth, and impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. Those are less conventional, and that's where I think you really need to look at state law as well and say, well, do I have the authority to do this? And if not, is there another entity I could transfer the money to so that they could undertake this endeavor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking, I'm looking, I see there's some really good Q&As, and I don't know if you and Tim want to jump in as well and either ask some of these or touch on them, but I think one of them just hit what you were getting at on being able to use some of these dollars for park trail capital improvements as investments in tourism.
I was going to say, guys, thank you for your comments. One of the common questions, we got 2 or 3 questions along the same line, and we were actually talking about this before the webinar, is the idea of cross collaboration between 2 townships, or a township and a village, a township and a city, a township and a county, multiple jurisdictions. Is there possibilities for everybody, for example, to pitch in $100,000 into a larger broadband project? Can you guys speak to that?
Yeah, so Peter and I talked about this quite a bit, and there's certainly no prohibition of, regarding collaborations. But again, I think that answer has to be qualified with, you've got to find the state authority to do it. In case of the question regarding like trails for tourism, I think that's what you mentioned, Peter. that falls under that category. Again, with the strong, there has to be a nexus there between that particular type of expenditure and a negative economic impact arising from COVID. So I think as long as you can make that connection, there's no problem with collaboration. But remember, when it comes to reporting, you should probably make sure that you keep track of those funds separately and can identify where they went. Would you agree with that, Peter?
Yeah, I do. And on the collaboration side, certainly there's nothing in the federal act that would seem to prohibit that, being able to do so. I think you're spot on, though. You got to look at the state law, because I think where you would worry about is I mean, and correct me if I get off base, because I'm just the tax attorney, I'm not the municipal attorney. Is if you start spending money well outside of your jurisdiction or your geographic boundary.
Right. Now, of course, some state statutes allow you to do that, and then you're fine. And you can certainly enter into all types of collaborations based on certain state statutes. Intergovernmental agreements are a common thing, and some of those statutes allow you to go outside your jurisdiction. But you're going to want to identify that state law, and then again, just track the expenditure. And be able to at least articulate the nexus to COVID, because depending on the type of improvement. Does that answer the question, Tim?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if not, if it didn't answer the question, folks, just go ahead and continue to type in that Q&A box, and you know, with a follow-up question, we can go from there. So, so should we at this point transition over into everything else that is part of the legislation? Does it sound good?
I think that sounds like a perfect time. And thanks again, Tim and Randy. This is a really great presentation.
Sounds good.
Thank you. We're happy to answer any more specific questions as well.
All right, folks, and so, you know, I'll take it from here. Like I said, you know, I'll bring this up again. One of the things that we wanted to share with you today is that, you know, this is, although we're talking about, you know, we've just talked about the state and local aid, that 350 billion coming down. There's another 1.2 billion in other funds, or trillion in other funds, that, you know, real quickly, you just, you know, we want to make sure you keep as part of your budgeting calculus as you continue to evaluate what you're going to put funding towards and what may be funded through something, you know, and for example, small business loans may come down, you know, instead of launching your own small business relief program, you may want to work and promote the SBA program instead. And so what I want to do is quickly walk you through some of these, you know, some of these larger buckets. One of the things I did do is I am keeping my updates here to only those that are more larger buckets. There's very detailed programs in here. There are certain programs that are getting $10 million, $13 million, $15 million. Although that's a lot of money, I mean, you're talking billions of dollars, I kind of cut it down. So anything under 100 million was not mentioned. So you may be aware of some programs on that I don't mention. The only reason I didn't mention them is because they were smaller dollar amounts. But real quick, in terms of small business relief, you can see here there's going to be about $52 billion coming down. They're plugging another $7.25 billion into PPP. The SBA is going to be running several programs, so we highly encourage you to reach out to your SBA or work with your economic development organizations to reach out to the local SBA folks. They have several programs that are going to be funded in the billions of dollars. They put more money into the emergency disaster loan program. Another $15 billion. I think that may have actually already expired. I think there was like a quick deadline of March 31st, but we can look into that. As well, the SBA will be launching a community navigator pilot program. So that'll be a program to specifically help disadvantaged businesses getting access, or folks that haven't traditionally been able to access relief funds, being able to access those going forward. In terms of education, I won't spend a lot of time here because obviously education is not kind of our bag here, but education is going to be getting a huge shot in the arm to the tune of 178, almost 179 billion dollars. With, you know, particularly for us, looking at the higher education grants there of $39 billion that'll be coming down. Lots of investment this time in childcare. There's a section here under childcare, which is $15 billion. there's more childcare program monies coming down on the human services side of the equation as well. So those communities that are trying to tackle childcare issues, childcare solutions in your community, again, this is something that you want to look into as you keep moving forward. There could be great opportunities for you guys. In addition, another $7.1 billion in addition to the broadband funds that are going to come, you know, that or the funds that can be used for broadband from state and local aid. The educational units of like the ISDs and stuff will also be getting $7.1 billion nationwide for broadband as well. Quickly, in terms of transportation, this is kind of my geek out space. Unfortunately, there's not much to geek out of with this one. You know, what you can see here, there's a lot of, you know, there's obviously a lot of funding going to $40 billion, but most of it, if not all of it, is all for filling existing gaps. This is not the investment side of things. We expect that those investment dollars in new projects and new capital projects and new services in terms of transportation will come down with the new infrastructure plan that's being proposed, that $2 to $4 trillion infrastructure plan. What you see here, especially in terms of transit, is basically just filling holes in ridership revenue that happened over the last year. Paying furloughed employees, getting them back on, providing some support for the airline industry and aerospace industry. So most of it is just gap fill from the transportation side. In terms of ag, just real quickly, USDA is going to be getting about $4 billion. So those rural partners that are on this call today, again, you know, reach out to your connections at USDA. Most of the funding you can see there, 3.6 billion of it is going to be dedicated to the food supply chain. So, and you know, unfortunately, when I looked at it, there's a good chunk of that money that's actually going to be going to USDA operations themselves. Things like, inspection employees, employee furloughs, and things like that. But there will be some funding coming down in terms of grants for mid-sized processors. So those of you with food processors in your region, major food processors in your region that were negatively impacted by COVID, there may be opportunities there, so make sure you stay close to your USDA folks. In terms of health and human services, I actually split this real quickly into two slides. Again, there's going to be a huge influx here. Most of, if not all of the health services, the $92 billion will go towards vaccine efforts, vaccination efforts, healthcare workers working vaccination efforts, awareness campaigns around vaccination efforts, and so much of that will be takes care of the health services side of things. And again, I'm going through these quickly, but we will be providing these slides for you as well as this recording, so you can go back later and look at the individual pieces of this. As I said here, in terms of human services, the vast majority of this is going to be in childcare, with about 39 billion of the 40+ billion in human services going towards some sort of childcare program. So again, huge opportunities here. And I know this is something we all face, whether we're an urban, rural, or suburban community. Childcare is one of the biggest issues we have in terms of talent and getting people to work. So real quickly here on FEMA, FEMA is going to be getting about $50 billion. For those folks that are doing disaster planning recovery. Again, most of this is around COVID-19 response. There's a little bit of leeway here, but most of it is around COVID-19 operations for FEMA. Housing, I was really excited about this until I actually read into it, and then I got less excited about it. Most of the housing initiatives, and we all want more housing. Unfortunately, you can see there $21.6 billion of that, and so over half of the $40 billion that are going to go into housing is around emergency rental assistance, which is absolutely needed. I'm not discounting that at all. But for those of us that are looking to leverage this money to make future investments in more housing in our communities, there's not a whole lot of leeway here. There is some housing choice options or housing choice voucher programs for about $5 billion. But again, these are nationwide numbers. So as they filter down into the states, they'll be far less. The one thing I did want to call out is the Rural Housing Support Program down at the bottom through USDA. Again, as our rural folks are working with USDA, this may be an opportunity to get in early. Obviously, $100 million spread across 50 states is not a lot of time or not a lot of money. But if you get in early and research the program and get in with USDA, you stand a better chance of tapping into those funds. In terms of technology and broadband, again, another 7.2 billion going to technology and broadband. Most of it is around schools and libraries. Obviously, public places. But there is some funding going to there, and then a small bit going to public broadcasting. And again, Peter and Jessica mentioned this briefly. Is that the timeline for this? The dates we've been told is no later than May 10th, which is again the 60 days from when the legislation was enacted, which is what they were mentioning, and then the second tranche coming down no more than 12 months from that. So, so thoughts on next steps. A couple of things we want to share with you. Obviously, we've already talked about a little bit. Randy mentioned this on, off the top. Really, for us, time is of the essence. One of the things that Randy and I were talking about, and one of the things that he mentioned is, your purchasing power. We would argue the purchasing power of that money starts to go down as of today, especially when you talk about broadband infrastructure and things like that. There's only so many companies out there that lay fiber, that put in peer-to-peer networks and things like that. And as well as I do, we're not the only ones having these webinars right now looking at this. And so as you look at contracts and contracting companies and those that are going to be willing to take on that work, demand is going to go up, prices will go up, and so thus your purchasing power is going to be, we expect to be going down here moving forward. We also understand that reality is what reality is. Many of us have some gaps to fill in our municipal budgets, in our public budgets, and so there's going to be a balancing act between filling those gaps and making more long-term investments in new things moving forward. Obviously determining funding sources. I mentioned that at the top of this quick presentation is that you're going to have to make some decisions. Do you want to invest in some infrastructure work through your funds, or do you want to wait and try and tap into some of that other 1.2 trillion that's coming down? So those are going to be some of the calculus efforts that you're going to have to go through on your budgeting efforts to make that work. One of the things we've been discussing internally, the Right Place has been around for over 35 years, and we all know that there's some very innovative thinking that happens in our communities, and there's some great ideas that are generated over the years. Unfortunately, just due to time and budgetary restrictions, many of those plans get put on the shelf. This might be a good opportunity to reach back onto that shelf and start dusting off some of those old plans and say, to what Peter was saying, start marking them green, yellow, red, and are there opportunities that are plans sitting on a shelf that you've already taken the time to work through, but now's the opportunity to actually get these things started. And then last but not least, I can't get out of this without making a pitch for your local economic development partners. Many of them are on these calls today. I think we have some friends from the MEDC, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, on the call. We're always here. We're operating in your communities around the region. Reach out to us if you need help with planning, or you want help with assistance or interpretation or connections. We're always willing to help. Just pull us in. We're only a phone call away. So with that, like I said, that was very, very, very quick. But I did want to leave some time for us for Q&A. So with that, Peter and Jessica, if you can unmute yourself, we'll kind of pop through these questions. My good friend Bob Sobey, up in our northern region, had a question. It says, do you think the cuts to revenue sharing could beat up some of the ARPA funds based on the argument, and basically the loss of revenue argument? It says CRLDG is not a replacement of this lost revenue because it's tied to eligible expenditures and not discretionary spending by a governing board. Do either of you would like to weigh in on that one?
Well, pulling out the statutory language of the federal act for the fiscal recovery funds, it tells us that these dollars must be used for government services to the extent of the reduction in revenue due to the COVID-19 public health pandemic. So I think, off the cuff, without really trying to research all the different issues and think it through, is that there's probably an argument to be made. But what's going to be critical is to identify that you're using these dollars for government services that you would have been paying otherwise with the revenue sharing. and then trying to show that there's this causal link to the drop in revenue sharing is because there's a reduction in revenue overall to COVID-19. So I think that's last spot is I think where there's a potential hiccup that could be encountered.
Good deal. So hopefully a quick and easy one. Someone had a question regarding, is a road commission considered a special purpose use of government?
So special purpose unit of local government is not defined, but if you look elsewhere in federal law, it's defined as any special district, public purpose corporation, or other strictly limited purpose political subdivision of a state, but does not include a school district. So it's pretty broad, and I would be inclined to say yes. I know there's an AG opinion out there on this very topic though, and I would want to read it because it sort of splits hairs about what's an agency versus a political subdivision and so forth. But again, it's not defined, and so off the cuff, I would say that it is.
Okay, thank you. Next question is a great question for you guys. It says, would legal fees associated with advice and unacceptable expenditures of the funds be eligible out of these funds?
It is a good question for the attorneys, and I would say generally it should be, because it is in response to advising with the compliance with the act. At least that's the argument I would make.
That certainly makes sense.
Sounds good. We got a question here from Tyler Kent, who I believe, we have a couple of Tyler Kents in the region, but I believe this is the MDOT Tyler Kent. Can these funds be used as a local match for other federal aid eligible projects? I've heard that it cannot be used in this manner, but not sure if there's guidance yet available.
It looks like Tyler's confirming it is the MDOT Tyler. That might be a question that needs to be resolved with future guidance from Treasury. I believe, if my memory is serving me appropriately, that under the CRF established by the CARES Act, there was some guidance that came out of the U.S. Department of Treasury that said the CRF dollars could be used for some matching fund as long as it's still an eligible expenditure. So, tentatively, I would think on the face of the statute there might be an avenue. I know certainly there was a push with the CRF dollars, which were more restrictive, to use those only for those, obviously you have to use them for the restrictive purposes, but if there were other federal funds available or other funds available for different programs that fit really easily into a desired expenditure, to use those others. Primarily FEMA was an example, that there could be some overlap, that the decision was almost always made to use the FEMA dollars over CRF dollars because there's less restrictions, less strings attached to it.
Sounds good. Related to that, there were some, put you guys on the spot, there was a question regarding smaller communities. And I know there was a formulaic approach to this. If you were under 50,000, population under 50,000, it was determined by the state. For those of us that haven't followed that, do you guys remember what that formula was or is?
Well, all that the statute indicates so far, again, is that it's based purely on population for those with a population of less than 50,000. And it's based on, sorry, I'm looking for it, a slightly more complicated formula for metropolitan cities and larger entities. So are they asking for, I'm sorry, more detail in terms of how that's determined, the actual population or the formula itself?
No, the question was specifically, is there a possible figure to get to available that gives that gives very small rural townships an idea of what they might receive if they didn't show up in some of the federal It's in the federal Excel sheets that came out. It dropped below.
Oh, okay. Okay. And I think, yeah, and I think that's tough because actually some of the guidance that I have seen acknowledges that, yeah, not everybody's listed. Not all of the non-entitlement units, so under 50,000, are listed. That doesn't mean that you're not going to get anything. It's just that they are not done doing their calculation yet. And I think we'd be really guessing it to try to figure out what they are going to get at this point. Have you seen anything that would indicate what they might get, Peter, beyond what's out there already?
No, I haven't seen anything further, Jessica, but I think one thing to watch for in the area of future guidance is that, and we saw this with the CARES Act dollars as well, that Treasury did come out and say that you could use a county, for instance, that had a direct allocation of CARES Act dollars could expend those by granting them down to a local unit within the county. I think that at the state level, that definitely was happening, and that was definitely something state of Michigan was required to do, but I think that's something we should be looking out for on future guidance, which might help some of the rural communities get a little bit more dollars as well.
All right, awesome. And Lynn's got a great question for us here. It says, if a township is in the early stages of planning for a sewer expansion and increased water availability, would the plans need to be firmly in place by the May 2021 deadline for that first tranche to come down? And I'll even expand this to say, look, if it's not just specifically water related, but if it's broadband or something else of that sort.
Would the plans need to be in place before they could even use the money for that purpose? Is that the question?
Correct. It says would the plans need to be firmly in place by the May 2021 deadline, which I'm assuming is the May tranche coming down.
Right. And I guess just thinking this through, I don't think so. They get an allocation and then they get to decide what they're going to spend it on. And they have until the end of 2024 to spend it. So I would not think that they would have to have plans in place. In other words, you don't have to sort of qualify at the beginning to get these funds. You're going to get these funds. And then how you spend them is really within your discretion, within these parameters. And so my answer would be no, you don't have to have plans in place in order to get that money or use it for those purposes.
Okay. And I'm going to speed these up a little bit because we are at 2:30. I'm willing to go a couple minutes over if there's more questions coming in, but we understand if people have other things to do. Again, we posted this in the chat in the beginning. We did record this webinar, so we will be sending out this webinar and the associated slides with it. And we will include our contact information, Peter's contact information, Jessica's, and my contact information if you have further questions. But getting back to these things, this is another $1 million question. Everybody had this going into this, Jessica and Peter. The word roads were not even, that ROADS was not even mentioned in this legislation. Is it safe to assume that roads, impacted by local business, you cannot use funding for any sort of road improvements?
We didn't talk about that. What do you think? I would say no. What would you?
I agree with you, Jessica. I think that's going to be a tough one to go by, just with, based on what the permitted purposes are in the statute. I mean, maybe somebody can come up with a creative enough argument to say it's the road leading to a hospital to treat COVID patients or to deliver vaccines, but boy, even there, I would be very leery and think that's aggressive.
Okay. One of the questions here we have from Toby Lake up north. Toby's asking, do you believe the funds could be used for salaries and benefits related to public safety, law enforcement, corrections, dispatch, etc., thereby, quote, freeing up, quote, dollars typically allocated for those projects like several counties did for the CARES Act dollars?
Yeah, great question from our friend Toby up in Lake County, and I think you can. I mean, cash is fungible, and so you're using it as long as you're using it for a permitted purpose. I think a lot of these permitted uses don't require no other funds available. So it's not a but for type analysis. So I think that would generally work.
Okay. And then I've got 3 more questions. I'm going to cut it off after Frank. If you guys have any more questions, we will be copying these questions down so we can follow up with you individually if you'd like. But we do have another question here from Melody. It says, could small townships use these funds to make enhancements to their park and playgrounds?
Again, I think as long as you can tie it to, I mean, certainly that would fall within tourism, travel, and hospitality. So you got that piece of it met. But again, you have to be able to tie it to a negative economic impact resulting from COVID. So I think you can make that argument. If in fact you believe that that's the case, I think you can. I think we could get there. What do you think, Peter?
I think there's an argument, but I think it's a close call, and that's probably one I wouldn't put at the top of a priority list and would move it to like a yellow. You know, if I was preparing my list, I would have it in a yellow category, and perhaps wait until there's more guidance.
Good deal. Somebody here asked, or Justin asked a question about villages. This is something that we had actually talked about while we were planning this week. Villages, were those that represent villages, quickly noticed that they were not on any representative list that came out from the government. Hasn't been determined yet that if villages will be receiving funding, direct funding as well.
Yeah, so we looked at this when we got that question, and villages are within the definition of non-entitlement local units of government, if you look further in the statute. And so you're in there, but then you're right, you don't show up in those estimates. That doesn't mean that you won't be receiving anything. It just means that that calculation hasn't been made yet. And so unfortunately, it's hard to tell, but there's no reason to believe that you wouldn't be covered because you are specifically mentioned within that definition.
Good deal. And Frank, last but not least, you win the award for this question. This is the last question that we have before we wrap it up. Is there a chance that a township will spend money and then have someone say it does not qualify?
There's always that chance. Peter, what sort of ramifications did you see in the context of CARES when people violated the parameters?
Well, I think the clients I worked with were actually fairly cautious on how they spent the money, and they tried to, for areas that they were concerned about, tried to back it up with file memorandums that justified their legal analysis. So yeah, there's definitely that risk. I mean, you're going to be submitting reports to Treasury. As someone who comes from the tax side and gets to deal with the Internal Revenue Service, you worry about the government body coming in, federal government body coming in 2 or 3 years down the road, where the facts, where no one really appreciates the circumstances at the time and can easily second guess a decision that was made or an expenditure. And I think it gets back to having when you have contemporaneous records that are showing how you spent the money, you can trace the dollars, and then also some documentation that supports the decision that was made. I think what we didn't get into that goes beyond the legal side is, of course, there's the political issue, and it's there always will be that risk where politically, while legally it might be a totally permissible purpose, politically it may not be as popular enough in the local community. So a lot to balance there.
Well, thank you, Peter. And we'll wrap it up now. We're about 6 minutes over. I want to thank everybody for staying. Looks like most of you did stay on to the very end. I put up here our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us. Consider us a resource as you continue down this path with this influx of money coming in. And with that, everybody have a great afternoon, and we'll hopefully see you soon out there. Take care.